Hi, everyone. Welcome to our special live edition of Spilling the Tea on GovCon. I'm Teresa Moon, Vice President of Communications and Marketing for Parabolis. We are the preeminent partnership for government contractors, providing holistic support that includes a line of credit to fund your growth. The purpose of this podcast is to assist small businesses with success in the federal marketplace by introducing them to industry experts and resources that they may not otherwise know about. Today, we welcome Trevor Skelly and John Shoraka of Government Contract Pros. They are both widely regarded and renowned for their expertise, and we are so excited to have them both join us today. Welcome, friends.
Good morning. Thank you, Teresa, for having us. Really appreciate it.
Great to see you. Thank you.
Thank you, Trevor. I do want to note before we get started that we are going to have live Q&A at the end of our discussion. So be sure to stay tuned until the end and send your questions through the chat so we can be sure to catch whatever it is that you want to know more about. But we have so much going on in our industry today. So we are really going to deep dive into some of the most pressing topics. So I want to get started. We are talking all things regarding navigating acquisition reform, compliance, and growth in today's federal marketplace. But first, let's let everyone get a little bit more acquainted with you both. So Trevor, I'm going to start with you. You've had a unique career across legal, military, and procurement roles. What led you to founding Government Contract Pros?
So I think so that is my background. John founded GCP back in 2017 after he left federal service leading these programs. And
Gotcha.
I was fortunate enough to meet John through a mutual friend of ours, Joe Jordan, and began to work with him. And I was super impressed with GCP and, GCP's mission to deliver best-in-class regulatory advisory services to small businesses, primarily, in the federal marketplace. But I'll leave it to John to speak to it, but I think, both of us really believed in these programs that we assist clients with. And so whether it was when we were in government and, trying to, myself as a contracting officer, doing set-asides and, doing requests for information and sources sought and trying to seek out some of those small businesses, whether it just be for simple services buys or, when I was my last duty station with the Navy with the Office of Special Projects in Washington, D.C., through the broad agency announcement process for R&D. So, small businesses really can do everything, small business, big impact. And that's what we've been doing since 2017. But John, your thoughts on the founding?
Yeah, John, sorry, I didn't mean to steal your thunder and give Trevor all the credit.
Wow, that's awesome. Trevor runs the show, actually. So yeah, Trevor runs GCP day to day. I appreciate it, Teresa. And I think from my perspective, at least when we started it, originally we had a number of other partners as well involved, and they all at some point or another have gone back to government and gone back and out in and out of the government. But I think from my perspective, there is a lack in the marketplace of really qualified professionals that can provide contracting, procurement, compliance advice at a quote unquote reasonable price. Now, some people might look at us and say, well, that's reasonable, but actually comparatively very reasonable. And I think it's a challenge in the marketplace for small businesses because you can't build it organically and go out and hire a bunch of people because you can't carry the overhead. But can you get it fractionally, and how expensive is it? And that was really the goal. How do we provide the assistance to small businesses? And as you know, Teresa, I ran the small business programs for the federal government from the SBA. And it became very visible that sometimes, even when you look at 8A companies, once they graduate from the 8A program, you see the sort of the dive or the cliff. And so how do you create support services around that to make sure that they have access to expertise to help them be successful and scale?
I think that's such a big differentiator for you guys because there are a lot of people who claim to be able to do the things that you guys actually do in practice. And so your experience at the highest levels of federal small business policy at the SBA alone sets you apart, but then your understanding of the day-to-day burdens and operational expense of the actual businesses that you're supporting is super important. And so I encourage everyone not only to pay attention to the discussion topics for today, but to check them out on LinkedIn as well and look towards, building a portion of your team out to incorporating something like what they can provide to you for sure. But We're really going to dig in today. The core understanding that we want to talk about is about all around acquisition and the FAR. And, this question is to both of you, so you can feel free to jump in as you see fit. But acquisition reform and FAR updates are ongoing conversations, as we know in GovCon right now. And from your two perspectives, what are the most important changes and, alternate paths that contractors should be paying attention to right now?
Well, I think, Teresa, you'll find out that it's not unlikely that Trevor and I might sometimes disagree, and we have different perspectives on things. And it's actually interesting because even with clients, I always say this, with clients, we sort of debate issues because ultimately there's different interpretations of what you see both in regs and policy, et cetera. From my perspective, I think if you look at, and we can get into specific parts of the FAR, and you can get into FAR 19 or 10 or 8 or 12. And trust me, Trevor knows those much better than I do as a contracting officer, and he rattles them off the top of his head. And I'm like, but I think overall, sort of my issues and concerns are, I guess, twofold. One is when you look at the rewrite, there's a lot of de-emphasis of the small business programs. There's small business, entire sections taken out when you look at oversight, when you look at procurement center representatives, when you look at small business specialists, there's a lot of de-emphasis of small business programs. Then the other part of it is that there's a lot of emphasis of government-wide acquisition vehicles. So, go to Oasis, go to STARS 3, go to these vehicles, best-in-class vehicles. And as we know, small businesses oftentimes can't get on those vehicles. And then if you're locked out, when is the next on-ramp? 5 years, 10 years? So what happens in the interim? And I think that creates a barrier to entry for small businesses. So the combination of those two things, I think, is a challenge for small businesses, and I'm really concerned about it. The 8A program as well, if you look at it statutorily, sole source is the path under a particular threshold. Everybody knows that, right? But if you look at the rewrites, at least the version that we saw, the default is, which doesn't match with statute, the default is, well, you got to compete it. So the statute says under a threshold sole source, the rewrite says doesn't matter, you got to try and compete it first, and then maybe justify sole source, which is contradictory. But I think those are sort of high level. I'm curious, see if Trevor agrees or expands or what his thoughts are.
Trevor, what say you?
I think I think John and I are pretty much on the same page on this one, Teresa, because this administration has really, to a degree that we haven't seen previously, focused on acquisition policy. And that really started in January. Right off the bat, we saw executive orders regarding procurement policy. And not only the procurement policy, but I think the administration of that procurement policy. So with the fork in the road, you saw a number of experienced civil servants exiting federal service, voluntarily or involuntarily. And so not only are you seeing a tremendous potential change, an actual change given the deviation process, but you're seeing not only a change in the process and the procedures, but actually who's administering it as well. And in our experience, there really has not been a significant amount of training for the civil servants that are remaining. So it almost becomes incumbent on industry to sort of train the government in these new procedures that we're seeing coming out. And as John mentioned, not only are we seeing the tremendous emphasis on government-wide acquisition contracts and, best-in-class contracts, and what OFPP, the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, will in the future designate as required use contracts, the effect of centralization of requirements. But we're also seeing a very heavy emphasis on competition. We're seeing an emphasis on firm fixed price contracting. We're seeing an emphasis on buying commercial solutions. We don't want to be, modifying for government purpose. We want to be able to buy off the shelf. And also, we are seeing a heavy emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We saw an initial order in January of last year. We saw another one last month, forcing subcontractors or, prohibiting, DEI policies on subcontractors. So there's just a lot to keep up with, as you said, and having to not only know those policies so that you can sell your supplies and services to the government, know those procedures, but also be willing to educate the government. That's where we're
Yeah.
seeing a lot of challenges.
So Teresa,
And it will be interesting. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, I was just going to say real quick, and Trevor mentioned this, right? DEI. I think it's not just DEI policies, as in the latest executive order. Does the government contracting firm have DEI policies, and how does that impact its ability to do work with the federal government? I think a lot of the set aside programs have been perceived as DEI and are being impacted accordingly in this administration. So there's a
Right.
lot of challenges when we talk about this, but there's a lot of challenges in the 8A program, being compliant, audits, applications, et cetera. And we can dive deeper into that, but you see it across the board. And, Trevor and I were looking at, and Trevor shared with me just recently, there's proposed legislation again with respect to eliminating some of these programs. I don't know if that has legs, but, this keeps coming up, obviously, and there's core challenges as well.
Yeah. And I mean, like Trevor had pointed out as well, there's so much contradiction and John, I think you said it as well, contradiction in the way that things were done before. And now we have this far overhaul and the two aren't cohesive at all. And so, especially for a newer and growing government contractor, it's hard for them, period, to come into an environment like this and navigate it right from the start. But when there's so much contradictory information coming out, and things have changed, where they would have leaned into might not have the best understanding to give them advice on what to do either. And so that's why we have conversations like this, so we can point it out, because I think that's, an additional barrier to entry is that some of them come in from commercial using that past performance as a way to have a leg into it, but then having to understand all of the different regulations and how they've changed so quickly and recently. The sole fact that we've had a revolutionary FAR overhaul, just calling it that in and of itself, and how slow the government is to move on things. This is the first time there's been anything done to it in 60 something years. So, and they can't even solidify where people need to be taking things forward from this point. So what does it mean in terms of all the overhaul that we've seen in practice for the businesses that you're supporting? How are these things currently impacting businesses that are pursuing and managing contracts?
There's two things, right? One is, from my perspective at least, one is, where are we with the FAR overhaul, right? Because we had heard that April would be the date that we'd see the revised package put out for public comment. We haven't seen that. So what does the time frame look like? I think the confusion in the marketplace, to your point, Teresa, is that these deviations were adopted sort of haphazardly by various agencies. So even who adopted what and what are you complying with becomes a challenge. And then lastly, I think what we are seeing is just inconsistency across the marketplace. And, inconsistency slows things down. And, I always joke with Trevor about the fact that, he not only did he used to be a Wall Street lawyer, which he's recovering from, I think, but he also used to be a contracting officer for 15 years. But I always joke with him because contracting officers are very risk averse. So you introduce uncertainty and things come to a halt. You introduce uncertainty with, can I do an 8A sole source? Can I do a $100 million 8A sole source? I don't need a justification if it's going to, an entity owned tribally NHO. But things are coming to a halt because of the uncertainty, and it's creating a lot of issues. At least from my perspective, I think areas where the government definitely feels they need the support, right? Let's say mission critical, cybersecurity, IT infrastructure, et cetera. We're seeing movement there and trying to figure out how we're going to engage with our vendor community. If it's not mission critical, it seems to be sort of a lot of slowdown and guesswork about what makes the most sense. Is this going to be okay? Am I going to get fired if I go down this route? Trevor, I don't know if, you work with the clients day to day a lot more than I do, but I think that's sort of what I've seen.
Yeah, I think, Teresa, if we look at the numbers on the small business side, the socioeconomic category programs, with the exception of service disabled veteran-owned small businesses, are generally down. Women-owned small business a little bit up, but HubZone a little bit, small business a little bit, but 8A is really the outlier in that the dollars that are being awarded to 8A contracts are way down. To John's point, we're also seeing that these changes are definitely not industry agnostic. Construction, a lot of activity happening in construction, a lot of activity in IT services. But, where we have this, to John's point on the conservatism of, contracting officers, we do see a lot of slowdown because, in the past, there was always a checklist, we go through our checklist. Okay, did you get your bids? Did you do your market research? And, those checklists really aren't available. Contracting officers are being told, figure it out, use other transactional authorities, go somewhere, you do something. And there's really just a lack of guidance. So when you combine that with the, historically long government shutdown, which occurred, only a couple of months ago, that threw off procurement cycles. So people are trying to catch up, figure out how to buy things. They're already behind schedule because of a loss of effectively 60 days. So, I would say those factors combined have really led to a lot of uncertainty and a lot of slowdowns and a lot of log jams. But, where clients are able to communicate clear regulatory procedures to contracting officers, we've seen success there.
Well, that's great. And that's a good, segue into why they need people like you, so that you understand the fact that is kind of part of the plan now, right? Being able to articulate that so that they see you not only as an expert in your field, but an expert in the process in order to do business with them. So I love that you point that out, because I don't know that everyone is able to do that the way that you guys do. And, John, especially with your experience with SBA programs like 8A in particular, right? And WASB and HubZone, where are businesses that are still entrenched in those environments and are really not so much using things, because people don't use them as a crutch, right? But they use them as an entry point to getting involved in opportunities that they might not be able to without it, just as a small business alone. Where are people running into more, I would say, misunderstandings than challenges? Because 8A program is paused, but they're still small businesses. And so there's still the participation capability there. But where are you seeing the most misunderstandings with the businesses in terms of the socioeconomic certifications?
Yeah, so obviously, I think the most challenging environment from my perspective is when you look at the socio categories. Obviously, it's the 8A program, right? And so even though statutorily the program, it's going to be very difficult to kill the program statutorily. You'd need a lot of, you'd have to use a lot of political capital on the Hill, and you need a lot of support to be able to kill it. However, what we are seeing is sort of a death by 1,000 cuts, right? So, we have applications not approved. And if you look at 2024, under the Biden administration, you had over 580 approvals in the 8A program in 2024. If you look at 2025, you had something like 66 approvals. And 45 of those happened before the change of administration. So you look at maybe 21 approvals. Then if you look at the balance of 2025, actually, we haven't seen any approvals since August of 2025. So we're going on to like 9 months, 8 months, whatever the calculation might be, of no approvals. So that's one slowdown. You see the audit, quote unquote audit, which, 8A companies were audited. That created sort of a chilling effect, right? Then you saw the Secretary of War's not only memo, but his TikTok video that, was a sledgehammer to the 8A program. But interestingly enough, when the memo came out, it didn't just focus on the 8A program. The memo post that video came out and said any small business set aside over 20 million. So it even expanded the oversight on all small business set asides over 20 million. And then one last thing, then we saw a memo from the SBA that said, and this used to be my program office, a lot of continuous eligibility activities happen at the district office or even at headquarters. But we saw a memo that said, any continuing eligibility decisions are the sole discretion of the new me, which is the Associate Administrator of Government Contracting and Business Development. Well, what happens then? It's a logjam, right? I mean, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of actions every day. So it's sort of a death by 1,000 cuts in the 8A program, which one creates a chilling effect, two creates a slowdown. You have sole source offers and acceptances that are going to the district office, but they're just sitting there. Contracting officers won't move forward because technically they can as per the regs, but why would they put their neck out on the line? So to me, that's the most challenging, but that's not all of it, right? Because again, Secretary of War memo, all small businesses over $20 million audited. And what you mentioned and Trevor mentioned, the folks that are quote unquote doing this audit, especially at the Department of War, are contracting officers. It's not centralized like the SBA audit. Each one of them is asking different questions. There's a ton of contracting officers and KOs that are gone because of the fork in the road. They don't necessarily understand the limitations on subcontracting, quote unquote, the pass-throughs. So they're asking the wrong questions or looking at the wrong data. You throw in joint ventures and limitations on that. You throw in products and supplies, and don't even mention the non-manufacturing rule waiver and all the implications of that. And they're really halting or bringing the program to a halt. And that's really concerning to me, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, especially from an innovation side. If we need to get, the mission executed for the warfighter, putting a bottleneck in the middle of it from an administration side, as you guys have talked about, is really devastating to pushing things forward. And especially in the IT stage and part of the industry, when things are constantly changing, by the time they implement things, it's going to be needed to be changed because technology has already changed by the time it happens. So there's so much going on with regard to that. So Trevor, with your experience on the contract administration side, what are some of the most common mistakes, getting to the actual award? What are the mistakes that you've seen that they make habitually after they've actually won the work?
Sure. So I think, with regard to getting the work really quick, Teresa, because you had sort of mentioned this, is we're seeing, clients are successful where they offer capabilities and their socioeconomic status is a nice to have. So
Right.
agencies want to get to these folks because of their unique capabilities, and these programs offer a way to get to them efficiently. So if the administration is concerned about efficiency, great way to do it. But let's assume, you've successfully won the award. There's a lot of assumptions that are currently taking place. And in particular, this is the way I've always done things. So to John's point, where in the past, contracting officers, myself included, and people who I work with included, never really asked about that limitations on subcontracting issue. Unless I was getting an email all the time directly from one of the subcontractors, that didn't even have the prime contractor's email domain on it. I was, it's working, everybody's delivering, everybody's performing. Let's not upset the apple cart too much. But now we have these clear directives. Well, I would maybe not so clear directives coming from headquarters to say, you need to ask these questions. So I would say one of the big mistakes that we're seeing is people do not have the documentation, or they are not tracking in real time their costs for these contracts, particularly as they rely on subcontractors to perform work. That is a big priority for the administration right now. So cleaning that up has been crucial. The other area where we've tended to see some maybe missteps or some confusion by clients is on delays. So, when you get your federal contract and you're very excited because, that dollar value that's in there was what you proposed, and hey, I think I can do the work and everything's good. There's usually, although it's getting smaller, ideally under the revolutionary FAR overhaul, there's, 20 or 30 pages of clauses in there. And there's a lot of language that's sort of built into the back of that contract that people tend to ignore. And especially where they're, to your point, if the government changes a requirement or a core, directs a contractor to do something that isn't necessarily in the contract, it's very important to provide timely notice to the government of those changes. If you can't access a site, if specifications are off, if you're receiving, different directions from different folks in the program office, it's incumbent on you as a contractor to immediately communicate those concerns to the contracting officer, because in many cases, if you wait more than 10 days, it's deemed waived and you lose that ability to recover or otherwise submit. We hear often, how do I submit a request for equitable adjustment? Well, the facts are good, but unfortunately you needed to tell the contracting officer within 10 days. So now we have to come up with something else.
Yeah. And that introduces a lot of risk into the situation itself, right? And so, because the onus is on the business, not on the government in all of these situations. And so it's so hard. We've had, legal advisors come on this show several times and say, unless you can prove that the government purposely was trying to hurt you in some way or form by changing something or making these adjustments, there's really no way that legal recourse is really going to turn out to your benefit. And so I think compliance and risk today is so, much more, it's always been important, of course, but as regulations are evolving and really having a team behind you that recognizes what all of that means to you as the contractor itself, how should businesses be thinking about that? I mean, there's companies that can support them to help them do that. And obviously, legal advisors and legal counsel all over the country will take that every day of the week, reading that for you and putting the clock running on it as well. I mean, Trevor, you were there. We're not going to throw you under the bus about it.
That's okay.
We like you.
No, that's okay. I think that the critical thing for industry to realize, especially in this environment, is that the government is going to shoot first and ask questions later. Yeah. We've seen this, for example, with the DEI and the DOGE terminations for convenience. We saw this with USAID. They said, okay, we're going to terminate for convenience all of these contracts, but industry has to be aware that if the government terminates for convenience, you are entitled to a termination for convenience settlement proposal. And your legal advisors or your regulatory advisors, the cost to you as a business to rely on those services to submit that termination for convenience settlement proposal is included. So the government pays for those services. So I think, in the current environment, whether it be audits or whether it be contract administration, just to understand that, where Teresa, as you mentioned, in the past, there might have been a sort of reticence on the government to raise these issues. Now they're just doing it and saying, we'll figure it out later. The consequences are what they are and we'll deal with it, because it was very splashy to say, we terminated, billion odd dollars of contracts for, or canceled $1 billion. But there's a regulatory process that goes along with that. And contractors, including our clients, were able to successfully recover, costs associated with that termination for convenience. But you're not going to see that number because that one isn't as exciting.
Yeah, right. And I think what's really important, and to Trevor's point, the shoot first, ask questions later. We even have seen that even when you have like a tabloid type report, like the James O'Keefe, the entity owned, I think it was a tribal 8A, the limitations on subcontracting. From what I understand, a lot of those contracts, a lot of that firms and the tribes contracts were terminated for convenience across various client agencies, right? Not just with one agency, but the ultimate result identified little or no problems with them meeting their limitations on subcontracting. So it was, the tabloid report came out, everybody jumped on it because, every agency wants to please the White House. So they wanted to recognize, yep, we're going to clean house. Whereas they didn't really look at, again, this goes back to the questions on limitations on subcontracting, know the rules, make sure you're compliant, but they didn't even ask those questions. And, you can technically, I'm preaching to the choir, but you can subcontract 50% of your work on a services contract, 85% of your work on a construction contract. Those are all legal, regulatorily approved, and a process that actually encourages small business participation because they can bring the expertise to support them. When you call it a pass-through and say, well, wait a second, who's really doing the work? It sounds bad, right? But regulations exist for a reason. And so shoot first, they lost all their contracts. Everything was terminated for convenience. Come to realize, well, actually, they weren't that far off of meeting their limitations on subcontracting, but they're already under the bus and they've lost all their contracts. So I think, making sure that you have all your ducks in a row. Subcontracting is really important. Before I went to the SBA, I used to help my dad run a federal contracting firm that actually did a lot of USAID work. But small businesses, oftentimes, to what we were talking about earlier, don't have the internal infrastructure to put in, if they're a prime, put in all the subcontracts and make sure you're meeting your limitations on subcontracting, document the subcontracts, keep a record of the subcontracts, keep a record real time on dollars spent on subcontracting so you can immediately reply back to the government and say, no, we're meeting everything, and then be able to give them the statutory or regulatory sites that confirms that you're compliant with your contract. That's all. So honest, full transparency. We seldom did that, right? We were a small business. We were like 4 of us running a small business. And it was very difficult to try to do that. Like we won the contract, to Trevor's point, we won the contract. We're like, wow, we won a big contract. Like, I don't know what all this FAR stuff is in the back, but we got to go get the work done. And so you go get the work done. And you're like, I don't know, come in and do the work to your subcontractors. Well, maybe we have clients that do this all the time. Let's go ahead and start the work. Well, did you pay for the joint venture or the joint venture addendum to determine what your performance of work is going to be? Oh, no, we'll worry about that later. Well, when later comes and you're having an argument over it, even without the government being involved, but you're having an argument over it, it's like, where's the paper? We don't have it. Well, what'd you agree to? I don't know. There's this email here and that email there. And Joe said this and Bob said that, and we disagree. So I think being compliant, but making sure you document everything is critical, especially in this environment.
And I think it supports even more so why other resources other than just your team of 4 is necessary. Because if you're not aware that these things need to be tracked and these things need to be provided and brought to the attention of, because like you said, so many are just like, oh, we'll figure it out. We're just going to get working on this contract because we want to get paid and we want to use it to grow into an even bigger contract. It presents so many problems down the line with regard to audits and litigation challenges and things that you could have done to protect yourself, beforehand, and doing things afterwards. It's not only a challenge to put together the argument that you actually didn't break any rules or anything like that, but then it's going to cost you even more because you're going to have to hire someone externally to fix things for you in a very short period of time. Because like you've said, a lot of the windows to bring things to the government's attention are very short.
Yeah.
And probably for a reason, right? If you don't give it to us quick enough, then you've lost your window of opportunity. And so that's the hardest part for small businesses because they run on such a short leash, because majority of business owners within the small business market are functional operators. They're not business owners. They're really good at what their capability is, and they try to keep the reins too tight for the overall operational aspects of the business for too long, and they seek out the external resources necessary, whether it is from a fractional perspective or actually putting someone in the seat to do it. And then that's trial by error too. If you pick the right person that's going to be able to do those things for you. So there's all of these pile up issues that small businesses already have before the issues with the overhaul have been imposing on them in terms of, well, where's the actual opportunity going to go if small businesses are getting cut out of it? And how's that going to affect the overall industry itself? When we're looking at small businesses that are effective and trying to grow within the federal space, how can they better position themselves to take advantage of programs that are still available for them, or mentor-protégé or JV opportunities? Where are you seeing the real growth path?
So I have a perspective on this, and I'm sure Trevor does too. I think we agree on this. I think one of the things, at least from my perspective in this environment, is to be as flexible as possible and reactive to changes. And look, so honestly speaking, small businesses are really good at that, right? Big business is not reactive and flexible. So take advantage of that. And it's a changing landscape, right? So service-disabled, veteran-owned small business companies are actually exceeding 8A dollars halfway through the year. We published that. And Trevor alluded to, 8A sole source, especially entity-owned 8A sole source, being significantly down. So with flexibility, one is, well, how, because contracting officers are risk averse, what are they being directed to do? Like, try to be flexible to make their job easy, right? What are they being directed to do? If they're being directed to go to SDVOSB, well, let's start finding partners that are service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses. Maybe we can do a joint venture with them. Maybe we can do a prime sub relationship with them. And to your point, small to small joint ventures, if the SDVO is the managing member, owns 51%, that joint venture inherits that designation, right? So even with some of our tribal clients, we tell them, look, we understand that your tribal 8A gives you potentially, it used to give you access to unlimited sole source with the J&A at 100 million, or that's gone up. However, given the current circumstance, you might want to find an SDVO to partner up with and do a small to small JV. And by the way, you could do two. One is the SDVO owns 51%, so it becomes an SDVO JV. The other is the tribal 8A owns 51%, so it becomes a tribal 8A JV. So you go to the client, and today they say, I need an SDVO. You're like, oh, okay, I got this one. Tomorrow they say, well, guess what? I got to do a $100 million contract. They need a, entity owned. You're like, oh yeah, I got that one too. So You have to be able to see what the marketplace is doing and what, quote unquote, I used to work at Baskin Robbins, by the way, at one point. What's the flavor of the month?
Yep.
And be reactive to that and be flexible enough to do that. Now, I will say you want to be able to trust your partners, right? Because when you have a joint venture, it's a marriage. And to your point earlier, Teresa, you see some of these in court, right? Like it didn't get documented correctly on the get-go. And so you see them end up in court and you're fighting and arguing about profitability and who gets what. But if you document it correctly and you trust your joint venture partner, you have to be flexible. A piece of the pie is better than no pie, is the way
That's right. Absolutely. Trevor, you have any differentiation there? Are you in agreement?
I think, I agree. I think, joint venturing is critical because we're seeing across the marketplace, we're seeing the dollar value of individual awards go up, with corresponding with the complexity of requirements. So John mentioned earlier, several parts of the revolutionary FAR overhaul sort of remove bundling analysis and whatnot. So we're seeing a lot more, procurements or many more procurements packaged into one, and those packages going to small, a shrinking number of participants in the marketplace. So I would say at this point, a joint venture, as John described, is really an indispensable strategy for small business at this time. And then I would also, encourage, again, looking at cost cutting initiatives because, we are seeing, the administration, like it or not, is very clear in its priorities, and that is firm fixed price, competition, commercial solutions. So, really trying to sharpen your pencil, but recognizing, during contract performance, if the government does change those, if they issue a stop work order, if there is a delay, ultimately that contract is there to protect both parties. And so, not to be afraid of invoking the protections that are in your own contract if you find yourself, in a problem situation.
Right.
And Teresa, that's a fine-edged sword. Is that the right idiom?
Double-edged.
Because
Double-edged.
double-edged. Okay, but it's difficult to walk that track, right? On the one hand, you have to be cost effective, you have to be super efficient, and you have to be competitive in this environment. And then firm fixed price, and how do you make those profitable? On the other hand, when I think about it, and I put my small business hat on, for me, if I'm spending money and I don't see a direct impact to the bottom line, that's money out of my end of year profit distribution, right? So a lot of times small businesses are like, wait a second, why am I paying for that? Because it's directly out of the distribution that I get at the end of the year. But you have to sort of strategize and think about a little bit more long term to what we've been talking about all morning is,
Right.
yes, it's not like I'm hiring a BD person and they're going to go out and win a $10 million contract. I'm hiring compliance folks. I'm hiring, a certification compliance, contract admin, but it is going to create the mechanisms to protect you in the long run and will potentially be more efficient in the long run and save you money in the long run. I think that's sort of the challenge
are
with
important.
small businesses because they're like, why would I spend money on that? And I've been there, right? Like, why would I spend money on an attorney? I'll figure this out on my own. But then you run into trouble. And then you save more for the attorney.
I would say, Teresa, this is also where I think peer-to-peer networking becomes really critical too, because you're not the only person facing these issues. There's other small businesses that are in this space. So, conferences or podcasts like this, or these are great opportunities to figure out, because people also like to talk about their successes. So,
Exactly.
learning from those, and then maybe even partnering with those is just so critical right now as everybody's, doing their best to respond to these changes. So peer-to-peer networking is just becoming, I think, even more critical, whether or not it's learning best practices or finding that teaming arrangement for that next procurement that's coming down the pike.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, especially given, this fiscal year itself has been one of the most challenging in history, if not long term for majority of the businesses that are engaging right now had never gone through anything like a government shutdown, let alone the longest one in history, or had never gone through a CR or sequestration. They don't even know what that looks like. And now we're in an environment where these could be common play practices for, the government and politicians. And it's directly affecting not only small businesses, but businesses across the board, right? When things shut down, it obviously affects everyone. And so there are a lot of shifts coming ahead, coming from a lot of different angles. Yeah. Where do you see that there's going to be the most impact? I mean, we're coming into the end of the fiscal year really fast, right? Where once we head into the summertime, we're basically there. And so how should contractors start preparing now? Not just for what we all know is kind of that looming, is it going to be another shutdown or a CR once we get to the end of September? How's that going to look? What, from your perspective, what the businesses that you're supporting, should people do now to prepare for what lies ahead?
I think you have to be looking at your pipeline, especially, because we advise clients, you should be looking at, option exercises. So if there's option exercises that are coming up this year that you hold, you definitely want to be looking at the notice period and the actual option exercise that's in your clause. But recognizing, as you said, Teresa, that 2-month delay in the sort of general procurement line, hey, we know that reach out to the contracting officer, reach out to the program office and say, hey, we know this contract is coming to an end. We haven't seen a sources sought. We haven't seen a solicitation. Here's our capability statement. Here's how we can get this work done, and be proactive. And also, come armed with the regulations. I mean, Part 12 and Part 13 were combined, and now anything under $9 million can be handled as an RFQ. You don't even have to do an RFP with, sources sought, and then you do your competitive range determination. Federal agencies can make award on commercial requirements under $9 million on an RFQ process. I guarantee you, if you tell contracting officers that, half of them will probably say that's impossible. But they also said the same thing about the 8A program. I can't possibly award a sole source to this small business using these procedures. But once you outline those regulatory steps for them, it's like, oh, you've done your job for me. I've got 1 million of these on my desk. I just want to get this off and move on to the next one. So that would be looking at the procurement trends that we're seeing. That's where we're pushing clients right now.
I think that's great advice.
The other thing that I'd throw in there is that when you look at your pipeline, 2 things, right? One is when you look at your options that you're exercising, I think we all know this, that's at the discretion of the government, right? So even though historically one would look at the options and say, well, I have an option, doing great work, pretty much guaranteed that I'm going to get the extra. But you have to remember that's at the total discretion of the government. So have those conversations early on, because there are discussions internally. Again, we've seen probably the worst of Doge, but we've had clients get Doged even, earlier this year. So just because you have the option doesn't mean the government's going to exercise it. So that's one thing to just be aware of, have those discussions. The other thing is, if you're looking at your pipeline and historically it's just been a standalone contract, have discussions with the contracting officer, because they're being encouraged to put them on these vehicles. So where is that contract going? It might just disappear tomorrow if you don't have those discussions to identify where they're going. And then if you're not on that vehicle, try to find partners that you can partner up with that are on that vehicle, because they want someone like you that has the past performance experience and agency experience. I think that's really important. And then lastly, I'd say, and you mentioned this, Teresa, earlier, as you look at your pipeline, and now we're getting late into the year, so this might not even be an option at this point, but because things are going through these larger vehicles, because contract requirements are being consolidated, to your point, a lot of nascent small businesses are going to require a mentor and a mentor-protégé joint venture to be competitive on some of these requirements. Think about that long-term with respect to your ability to be competitive. And I know we've seen mentor-protégé joint ventures be challenged in Oasis, and how many past performance, qualifications can you provide, et cetera, and there's court decisions. But ultimately, those MPJVs can be a lifeline for small businesses in this environment.
And I think a lot of people are understanding that, because I'm hearing more and more about it and recent history than I have prior to. So I think that's great advice, that if people aren't looking into that now, you'll see a lot of teams shifting to that mind frame, because it is working for them. And so I think it's super important. We are coming up on the end of it, and I know we already have a couple of questions, so I'm going to open it up. If you haven't already sent your questions into the chat, please do so now. But we do have one that came through from Michael. He said, we know that there's been an 8A approval, hasn't been an 8A approval since August of 2025. As someone who applied for their certification in August of 24, what's your professional opinion on the timeline or date when the SBA will get back to putting out approvals? Get out your crystal ball.
Trevor, you want to take first stab at that?
Sure. So yes, I think at this point there's litigation. There's a number of groups that are either defending the program through litigation or considering what I would call offensive or affirmative litigation, potentially looking at the SBA's failure to administer this program as required by statute. The statutory requirements and then the SBA's own regulatory requirements are very clear on the timeline for these programs. So I would say, now is also a time to speak up. Obviously there's an event coming up in November that's going to be pretty important, an election. And so, reach out to, and I couldn't say this when I was in government, John, you couldn't say this when you were in government either, but, it's time to reach out to your representatives and let them know, how important these programs are to you. There's a website out there right now, 8afacts.org. Take a look at that. That actually provides numbers on a state and district basis on the dollars that are going to these areas through this program. So my advice is we have to look outside of the SBA potentially for corrective action, and whether that comes through the Article 3 courts or whether that comes from the Congress, that's where the corrective action is going to take place. I think we've been outspoken. GCP has been kind of outspoken in our, I would say, criticisms of, the administration for the failure to timely either approve or decline these applications. But John,
I was just going to add that, it's difficult to use the crystal ball to determine what the agency is going to do, right? Because I think the agency publicly has said that, look, we inherited, this is again their perspective, we inherited a mess. Everybody was getting in. We're cleaning house. We had to do the audit. We're looking at annual reviews. Once we clean house, we will update our process and procedures, and then we may open the door back up. Well, what does that mean? Is that 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years, or maybe 3 years? That's unknown, and I think that's creating a lot of frustrations. The other thing that we haven't talked about, Teresa, is that there are proposed regulations on the 8A program, which potentially significantly limit the ability of folks to participate in the program, individuals with what their economic disadvantage status is. So be on the lookout for that, right? That will go out for public comment. To Trevor's point, be on the lookout, raise issues when you see it. We'll inform our clients, and we do a good job of sort of informing the public on issues. But now is the time really to let your congressional delegation know how important these programs are and how it impacts you locally in your districts.
Yeah. And I would encourage everyone that's listening too to connect with you guys on LinkedIn, both the company page and to both of you individually, because you do put out a lot of great information that is timely, but people might not be aware of it. And so they can utilize that to kind of, light the fire underneath them in order to, further some of the things that you both have said. And so unfortunately, that was the only question that came through, but I'll encourage everyone. We're going to be posting this out, of course, on all of our platforms, but we do have a Spilling the Tea on GovCon page on LinkedIn. If you join that, you can add your questions there and directly chat with John and Trevor.
Awesome.
To connect with them on any other issues that may have come up and you just didn't feel like this was the right, forum to be able to ask it. And so I want you to encourage you to reach out to them on LinkedIn. I do have one last question though. You guys are always out on the road a lot. Yes. What's the best way outside of connecting with you on LinkedIn? What conferences are you guys going to be attending in the coming months? You guys are all over the place. I know it.
Yeah, we will be at National Veteran Small Business Council Conference.
I'll see you there.
Yeah, awesome. Looking forward to that. Definitely the HubZone Council Conference in July. Trevor is doing some training out in, is it Montana?
Idaho next week. So the National Center does a lot of great regional training events that are free for folks to attend. So We give presentations there. I'll be out in Idaho next week. I think we might be up in Alaska for the event up there in June. The Hub Zone is in July. And so there's a lot of great events out there. And, even though I think it's been interesting, Teresa, I think there's, a hesitation to attend events, especially given where government travel is at. It's like, if I can't connect directly to government folks, is it worth my time? I would say it is, because, again, I think the peer-to-peer networking is invaluable at this point.
Yeah.
And just recognizing, hey, the SAMI folks do a great job of getting the military and DoD folks to attend their conferences, but a lot of other ones, even if you don't have that headliner that's from the government, you're still going to meet other great contractors that you can network with and figure out best practices, teaming opportunities, and all that great stuff.
I agree. And Paths 26 seems to have a good lineup of government coming. So that'll be great given, what the attendance has been in past events. And so I'm looking forward to that.
Teresa, one last thing I'd throw in there, just for the firms that are looking to potentially network. And to Trevor's point, sometimes the government doesn't show up at these events because some of the restrictions they have on travel now. I would look at industry days or matchmaking days at the buying activities that you're interested in, right? Because, Wright-Patterson might have an industry day, or Aberdeen might have an industry day. They encourage their large primes to participate to identify subcontractors. So look at where you're selling and potentially try to meet them at the local level if they're not participating on the national.
That's great advice. And, you gave a lot of great tips and insights today. So I definitely appreciate both of your time. And we're definitely going to have you back on the show when things start to close out. I know we're waiting on some information to come out. We're probably going to be waiting, but once it comes out, we'll have you guys back to give us an update on everything that we talked about today. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Awesome. And thank you all for joining us. As always, we pride ourselves on sharing the most insightful and exciting people and information to help you better navigate your GovCon journey. If you like what you heard today, you can see all of our past podcasts, which are archived on our Parabolis YouTube channel. Stay tuned for all of our future guests in the coming months as we help you grow to great heights in the year ahead. I'm Teresa Moon, and this is Spilling the Tea on GovCon. Have a great day, my friends.